I still actually have some of those notebooks if you guys want to come by my house and read them. So, as a newly minted father, I've discovered a few things that you don't really understand until you're actually a parent. People tell you a lot of things about it as you're going through the process. Oh, this is going to happen this way, and this is going to happen to you, and you just don't get it until it actually happens. And one interesting thing that is really understated about children is that they come with time dilation fields, especially when you have twins, because it doubles. And so I have been learning that to get any sleep and actually still do my job and accomplish things in life, I need to find some efficiencies and leverage them like never before. And so, I've got to reuse things in life. And that means that I'm going to practice my dad jokes on you guys today and practice my storytelling skills on you guys today and just take advantage of that overlap as best I can. Also, you may have to give me a pass on some of the jokes because they're probably a lot funnier at 3 a.m. than they may be today. So, one of the most common stories that you might tell your children is, of course, the classic fairy tale. And when I think of telling stories, there's a specific movie that gets stuck in my head, and that's the Princess Bride. And if you're not familiar with The Princess Bride, it's a little bit of a cult movie, but it's the story of a granddad telling his grandson a story from the book The Princess Bride, which is great in meta in itself. And I think for some of us, there are other fairy tales that might come to mind. Sometimes you might get other things stuck in your head that you could just wish you could let it go. So now that I've grown up some regular jokes into, sorry, my notes are jumping around here. Now that I've kind of grown up some jokes, I want to give some serious kudos to our team. As a project that I'm about to discuss was built by a bunch of people, and I'm just one small part of that. The right team is really important when you're trying to build something like this. And this is definitely an ongoing project for us. There's commits every day. We just pushed some new features out this week, which is pretty major for us. And so we're constantly improving on, and this is a work in progress for us. A couple of years ago, our client had 6 major websites that they were working with. They were humming along pretty decently, handling content. They had decent performance metrics. The asset management for each of these sites was going pretty decently by all accounts. Now, of course, we had faced down our share of monsters with that particular site. And so one particular piece of information about this client is that they have a lot of thumbnails, and they have a lot of sizes for their thumbnails. And in WordPress, you're probably familiar with how that works, as it generates those when you upload them. And so they have, when I went through the code base, I think that I counted up a dozen, but that was only the ones that I could find. There's probably more sizes of assets in there. And so you can imagine if you start uploading several megabyte assets and you're transforming them to different shapes and sizes for different places and throughout the site, that can start taking up quite a few resources. And so that started to impact their server in some negative ways. And sometimes it would cause images to just disappear because they were timing out in the transformation process, or sometimes the server would lock up and time out because it was getting hammered. If you're uploading, 25 different assets that are getting transformed 12 times each, it's sort of a little bit intense resource-wise. And so that was one of the places where we first started to look beyond the built-in WordPress solutions for this particular client to see what we could do to support them better. And we needed to add some CDN support for it and things like that. And so the solution at that time was an open source project called Thumbore. And so that was what slayed the monster of thumbnails for us. And it can be configured in quite a few different ways. But we were able to leverage it by moving the image processing off of the main server and then getting those images and assets processed into a CDN. But really, other than some small monsters like this, we were doing pretty great. Everything was rolling along pretty well with this particular client. And then one day they came to us and they said, we need to add triple the sites that we currently have, and we need to add some complex rules for visibility about content. across those sites. And then we need a universal content editing interface for all of this content, because some of this content now needs to appear on any of the sites at any given time, or sometimes it's going to sunrise on this site over here, sunset on that site, and then appear on this other site over here. And so the ROUSs don't exist, right? But for us, they did for sure. That was a turning point. So just to give you some context a little bit on how complex this site can get, here's a screenshot from one of those sites with a list of some of the different data models that we pull out of that site. And so you have, and this is actually one of the more simple and straightforward examples. You have a film and a synopsis and some art that goes with it and things like that. But things can get really complicated really fast. In this particular example, you're looking at something that has relationships between a show and a show that has seasons and seasons that have episodes, and then shows that have synopsises and episodes that have synopsises within the show, and then you have bios for cast and characters, but those bios can be attached to any number of those different pieces, and it just starts to snowball out of control. So things had been going really swimmingly with this particular client, but we had a whole new set of challenges because we're talking about something where the current stuff that they were doing in WordPress was not going to be a good fit. Our first challenge, and I'm going to boil this down to two basic challenges that, for the sake of time, we're talking about. There were certainly more than two. The first really big challenge in that is something that you probably saw as I described some of that, and that's the relationships between the data in their site. You start with like post to posts and custom fields and taxonomies and trying to manage these different relationships. And in the new system, we needed even more complex relationships. The requirements around visibility of content and multiple sites managing that content and all of that stuff just added so much that we were concerned WordPress wouldn't be a good fit for it. And then there's some limitations, even if we had built that solution in WordPress, that you can't optimize queries as effectively. So you start ending up with a query that has to call a subquery, that has to call a subquery, that has to call a subquery in order to just render a page. And sure, you can cache some of that stuff, but you can't optimize the 15th subquery in a data set like that. The second challenge that we had that I'm going to talk about and our resulting solution was that we also had a very large data set that a third-party API provided to us. And so most of our clients' content is managed within the WordPress interface, but a subset of specific assets are managed by this third-party service. And so to meet our clients' needs, we need to pull data from the third-party API and then synchronize that data with our data, because this data dump from that third-party API is so large that it takes about 2 hours to synchronize. So it's not something you could just do on the fly. And then we needed to do a series of transformations based on that third-party data. And then, of course, then based on that data, we also need to go back to the third party for additional endpoints to make sure that we had all of the correct data. So now that we've identified some of the pretty major challenges, I want to talk about our approach and how we solved those challenges. I wasn't there for the original part of the project where the proposal was generated, so I'm not fully familiar with the full scope of options that were evaluated at the time that we pitched this to the client. What I can tell you about is the solution that we landed on and that we built and is in use today. And what we ended up proposing to the client was a hybrid of WordPress and a tightly coupled with the Laravel API. So that allowed us to leverage things that were great in both ecosystems and sort of focus on what each one was good at. One of the things that Laravel happens to be better at, in my opinion, than WordPress is the data modeling. The Eloquent ORM is super powerful, and probably the most powerful feature that attracted us to it was the ability to easily handle those relationships. As you remember, that's kind of a complex thing. And so In Eloquent, I can easily define these many to one, one to many, and many to many relationships, and I can also really easily chain those relationships together. So I'm going to borrow a really simple example from the Laravel docs to kind of explain how powerful this can be. If we imagine that we have a model for books and another data model for authors, in WordPress land, this would be a custom post type for each one, or it'd be custom fields with data pulled in for something else, something like that. That's a fairly simple set of relationships. Each book has an author. So if I want to get all of the books and the author's name, I could do something like this. And you guys have probably seen some WordPress code somewhere along the way that looks a little bit like this, that does a similar type of process. What isn't obvious on the surface here is that if we have a dozen books, we actually are making 13 different database queries in order to pull all of that information into a template. And so Eloquent actually supports eager loading these relationships. So not only can I filter and chain the relationships together to get the right set of data that I want, I can make things a lot more efficient with very little effort. So I can do something like this. This small change basically says, hey, eager load also the author relationships for me. And so now I get 2 queries instead of 13 queries, one for the books and one for the authors. And so you can also read this a lot easier than when you start getting really crazy queries. And we're able to be much more efficient with our queries than what I think an equivalent solution in WordPress would have been. We're also getting huge advantages because we're not inventing our own object relational models. We're leveraging an open source one that already exists, and so we're able to use their best practices and keep up with their code as opposed to having to invent our own, because you could certainly do that. Just a quick side note, I found this really cool project while I was looking through and researching this stuff. You can totally use Eloquent in WordPress, and there might be cases where you want to do that. So this is a guy who's put together a package that'll let you do that. And if this is something that's interesting to you, or you're seeing challenges like this on a site that you're working on, definitely check this out and see if that's something that you can leverage yourself. So going back to the second part of our challenge, we have this workflow for the third-party API where we've got to go get this giant data feed. We've got to apply that data feed to our data set, and we've got to generate a whole bunch of different changes based on that. And not only does Laravel have powerful features that are great with data modeling, it also has a couple of features that are really important to us in this regard. And so we need to do this type of stuff consistently without taking the server down. And remember, there are thousands of items in this particular data feed. And like I said, it takes about 2 hours to run in the current phase. And so what we ended up using was Laravel's built-in tasks and queues. So our workflow starts with a daily task that runs on a separate server, so we don't accidentally take down the main server. And it operates on the data feed. It creates tasks related to the things as it works through that. And then it just fills a queue up with items. And so Laravel you can use a Redis backend. You can use Amazon service for simple queue. I think I'm probably saying that wrong. But you can use several different backends as a queuing service, and then you can just stick things in them, and the workers, because you can use more than one, can go through that queue, and they'll just process them according to the code base that you've given them. And I was looking at it this morning, and we actually have 37 different jobs that happen on the site in a variety of different patterns, making sure that all these things happen in the background without taking down the site. So I hope you guys didn't suffer too much from that. I hope you're inspired to think about some external solutions that can support WordPress and tightly couple with APIs, and that I maybe sparked a few new ideas for you. I'll have the slides posted up on dougcohn.com later on today. I do have some time for questions.
All right. Anybody who has questions for Doug? Oh, yeah, round of applause. Thanks, Doug. My bad.
Great talk, thank you. It's funny, our team was just having this discussion this week of can we use Laravel to work with WordPress for a complex API we're looking at, and we're deciding whether we should do it or not. Can you speak to, are there any big caveats with that of like, hey, watch out, this is going to happen, or any big hurdles you had to overcome to get both systems to kind of work together, as it were?
Sure. So probably the biggest caveat is the way that we're approaching it. We don't allow anyone to actually touch Laravel through the API. So just WordPress actually talks to Laravel. So that's a round trip request every time to the Laravel API that you can't just build into the front end, because we have a lot of restrictions around who can see what. And so we need to make sure that that's protected. And so the simplest way, at least at the time that it was built, was to use WordPress to manage the authentication, and then the data comes and is filtered through WordPress out back to the end user. So it's not as efficient as if you're using a Vue application and you're just hitting API endpoints, and some of those endpoints are in Laravel and some of those endpoints are in WordPress. But we had very specific requirements around user authentication. And so that's one of the concerns that we had for sure. If you're using all public data stuff, then it becomes a lot easier, and it just becomes, I think, mostly about documentation of which API is doing the heavy lifting for which part of the site.
More questions? All right, thank you, Doug.